Hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. My name is Gabriella Carolini. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning here at MIT, where I also serve on the MIT Africa Steering Committee. And on behalf of that committee, I'm so very pleased and honored to welcome you all in joining us for an excellent discussion today on movements and change, race and justice in Africa today. At a time when so many people across so many countries, very much including our own, are grappling to dismantle structural racisms and struggling to build anti-racist futures, we felt that it was an especially compelling and important moment to invite and bring together some of the leading voices from the African continent, as well as the African diaspora, who are engaged in critical public discourses around race and reform across diverse contexts on the continent, but also through different media. We have a large group of people joining us today, of course, through Zoom, but also via webcast. So we wanted to make sure you knew that the panel discussion is being recorded and will be posted. So if you're comfortable, please leave your cameras on. If you're not comfortable with that, please turn off your cameras. We have enabled the chat feature on Zoom between participants and the host only. So for those of you who are on Zoom, please note that questions can be submitted through the chat box. And for those of you who are joining through webcast, questions can be submitted through Slido. I'll share a very quick rundown of the program. We will start with our panel discussion for about 40 minutes, and this will be followed by a general question and answer period for about 10 minutes. And lastly, for those of you who are joining from MIT, we will have another 25 minutes or so in breakout sessions with our excellent panelists. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce and thank MIT's Associate Provost, Professor Richard Lester, who has been a real champion for the Institute's international policies and programs, and in particular for his tremendous support for our growing engagements with colleagues and partners on the African continent. We're so grateful for all of your efforts, Richard, and that of your office, and in particular, Jen Camacho and Beth Dupuy, without whom we could not have pulled together this amazing panel today. So thank you so much, Richard. I will pass the microphone to you.
Thank you, Gabriella, for that introduction. And I'd like to thank you and the other distinguished members of the MIT Africa Faculty Steering Committee, Professors El Fati, El Tahir, Ama Edo, Munza Dale, and Tavneet Suri, for your leadership in organizing today's panel. And of course, I'd like to add my welcome to everyone who's participating with us today. In 2017, my office produced a report called A Global Strategy for MIT, which highlighted the importance of expanding MIT's collaborations and partnerships on the African continent. And over the past year, I've spoken to many MIT colleagues about new opportunities to expand MIT's Africa-related activities. And out of these discussions and through the leadership of the MIT Africa Faculty Steering Committee came the idea of the MIT Africa Distinguished Visitors Program that we are going to launch this fall. In each semester for the next 2 years, one or more distinguished African visitors will be invited to spend time on the MIT campus as part of a program to build new connections between the MIT research community and our counterparts and colleagues across the African continent. These visits will feature keynote lectures delivered to the MIT community and will also provide other opportunities for engagement with our faculty, our staff, and our students across the Institute's schools, departments, labs, and centers. We anticipate that these activities will help to lay the foundations for new research initiatives between MIT and African collaborators. They will also help to strengthen MIT's community of faculty, staff, and students whose work is motivated and informed by challenges, problems, and opportunities of particular significance to African societies. This new program reflects the interest of our faculty, our students, our staff, and our administration in strengthening our intellectual engagement with leading scholars, practitioners, public figures, artists, and innovators from across the African continent. And it also reflects our expectation that frontier scientific research on major global challenges and frontier applications of new technologies to address these challenges will increasingly involve and indeed center on the African continent. Others will comment, and indeed have already commented, on the importance of today's panel on race and justice across Africa and its special importance in light of current events. But here, I just want to say that we are delighted to be able to announce our plans for the Distinguished Visitors Program at today's event. And finally, I'd like to express my great appreciation to our panelists, Bukola Adebayo, Khaled Albai, Professor Mokoena, and Professor Pierre for joining us, and I'm truly looking forward to the discussion. Many thanks, and now let me turn the program over to my colleague Ama Edo, the Homer A. Burnell Assistant Professor of Anthropology and African Studies at MIT, who will be moderating the panel. Ama?
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Richard, for that introduction. Thank you all for joining us, and especially the warmest thanks to our panelists for accepting our invitation. It is such a delight and an honor to be able to share space, even if only virtually, with you all today for this discussion. What I'll do is just kind of give a little bit, a 2-second sort of introduction to why we're asking the questions we're asking today, which Gabriela and Richard have already pointed to, before then introducing our panelists and launching into the discussion. So, you know, when we were thinking a few months back about what our vision with the steering committee for this series, we thought it was important for the conversations to be anchored in topics of current global urgency. And certainly the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that took off worldwide just a little under a year ago have been a defining aspect of that year, with millions of people around the world calling out police and state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies. And everywhere these demonstrations have taken place, it's been in solidarity, of course, with US protesters, but also drawing attention to the scourge of police violence in individual countries. And so in the respective countries where protests were coming up. And so in Nigeria and South Africa, for example, last June, protests, Black Lives Matter solidarity protests protested against police brutality generally, but also violence targeting women specifically, or violence against journalists and so on. So the thing is that while police violence is widely recognized as a problem across much of the continent, as we are finding in the US also, the place and the workings of race and structural racism within African contexts, South Africa aside, is far less part of the conversation about political and social reform. And so a key aim of our conversation today is to reflect on these questions, both within and across different African countries, right? What race and racial justice mean from, in, and for Africa today, the place or relevance of racial justice in demands for political and social reform on the continent, what movements against police and state-sanctioned violence in African contexts make visible in those settings? If not, so what we're seeing in for these protests in the US or in the global North is structural racism being brought to the surface. To what extent is that true also in African contexts? And if not that, then what is being brought to the fore through these protests? And then also to talk a little bit about the linkages that exist or that might exist among movements for social reform on the continent and elsewhere, whether in the global South or in the diaspora. So these are some of the questions that we're hoping to touch on today. And to talk through them, we have this phenomenal panel of speakers who each work on race or racial justice or social justice more broadly in Africa or on Africa from a range of disciplinary stances and geographic locations. So we're really in the spirit of coming at this really crucial and urgent problem from all angles. I think I'm just so excited about the various perspectives that we're bringing together in this conversation. So I will introduce our speakers and then we will jump right in. Bukola Adebayo is senior producer for the CNN Digital Bureau in Nigeria. where over a decade, she's covered a wide range of topics, including social injustice, political uprisings, human rights, and the environment. Namely, her inquiry and reporting on the 2018 Sex for Grades scandal in a Nigerian university contributed to the rare prosecution and conviction of a lecturer for sexual misconduct. Ms. Adebayor is currently a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, studying how media coverage can shape narratives on sexual harassment and gender inequality in Africa. She's a student fellow advisor for the Pulitzer Center and an alumna of both the National Press Foundation and the International Institute of Journalism in Berlin. She also previously reported for The Punch, Nigeria's most widely read and circulated news platform, where she ran the health desk and wrote investigative stories about medical and environmental issues. Thank you. Khalid Albey is a Sudanese artist and political cartoonist who became widely known during the Arab revolutions in 2011, with his works appearing as graffiti and posters across the Middle East, North Africa region. He is the creator of the satirical political cartoon series Khartoum, a wordplay on cartoon and Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. In addition to his two books, Khartoum and Sudan Retold, Mr. Albey's political commentary has been featured in various media outlets. He was named number 4 on the list of the best cartoonists in the world by The Independent in 2017. He was an inaugural Soros Art Fellow in 2018, as well as an Artist at Risk inaugural Freedom Fellow. He's also the founder of the award-winning space sharing platform FADA, Sudan Art and Design Library, Sudan Artist Fund, and Doha Fashion Fridays. Dr. Hlonipa Mokoena is a historian specializing in South African intellectual history and visual culture. She is associate professor and researcher at WISER, the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. She's the author of Magema Fuze, the Making of a Cold War Intellectual, and her articles have been published in various journals in African studies, visual culture studies, and art history. She has also written catalog essays for artists Zanele Muholi, Mohau Modisakeng, Sabelo Mlangeni, Sam Lengetwa, and Andrew Chabangu. She is currently working on a book about African men in military and police service in South Africa, a study that is anchored in the Visual Historical Archive. And finally, Dr. Jemima Pierre is Associate Professor at UCLA, jointly appointed in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Anthropology. She's also a research associate at the inaugural Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Pierre's research and teaching interests are located in the overlaps between African studies and African diaspora studies, and engage 3 broad areas: race and political economy, transnationalism and diaspora, and the cultural politics of knowledge production. Dr. Pierre is the author of The Predicament of Blackness, Postcolonial Ghana and the Politics of Race, which was awarded the 2014 Elliott Skinner Book Award in Africanist Anthropology, among other honors. And Dr. Pierre is currently completing a book manuscript on anthropology's epistemological and racial legacies in and about the African continent. She's also continuing a longitudinal archival and ethnographic study of resource extraction in West Africa through the frameworks of coloniality and racial capitalism. So as you see, we have a range of interests, all touching on these topics of racial justice, police violence, and state violence. So without further ado, let's just get into maybe the stickiest part of this question, and the question that's at the heart of this, namely the relevance of race in Africa. I was quite shocked, I shouldn't say that, maybe it's too soon to reveal my own sort of proclivities, but I'm always surprised to hear discourses that race doesn't matter in Africa, outside of South Africa, right? So in South Africa, there's apartheid, there was apartheid, that was a special case. And so I'd love to just launch this question to you all. I know, Dr. Pierre, you wrote a whole book about this also. But what the 2 main arguments that we often hear are about the fact that race is a diaspora or a South African problem, or that there are more important problems to deal with than the colonial past, right? That they're pressing issues that affect everyday life in a way that is more urgent than dealing with the past. And so I thought it'd be interesting to just start by digging into this question. What is the relevance of race in and for Africa today?
I think I can start from from the West African perspective. And you're so right. I mean, we get this sort of questions about, especially I remember during the summer of last year, during the George Floyd protests, and we're looking for people to write op-ed pieces for CNN Africa on how what is happening in the US just intersects with what is happening in Africa. And a lot of the people we approach were like, we don't think that race is a problem in Africa. We don't think it's something we should interrogate. And I do understand people that share those kind of thoughts. And I think it's because many times we've not interrogated a lot of the colonial engagements we've had in the past. It's been eroded, but I will speak quickly about that. I think the present, during the protest about George Floyd, a lot of people across Africa were calling, a lot of the anger were targeted at removing statues, removing memorabilia that reminded of colonial leaders, enslaved, those that were involved in the enslavement of African people. But we also do forget that a lot of Africa's heritage, and I will speak specifically to West Africa now and Nigeria, and some countries in Senegal, some countries in West Africa, a lot of artifacts. I'm even talking about cultural artifacts now. A lot of Nigerians' Benin broses are being held in countries such as Belgium. I mean, the British Museum has a lot of Nigeria's artworks. And we can't forget that there was a brutal past to these artworks being taken out of the countries. And there's still not a racial reckoning or justice or repatriation of some of these artworks. Not just the artworks, even some form of literature or just culture that's just been taken forcefully from the continent and is being housed somewhere else. And these discussions also, there needs to be some sort of justice and some sort of conversation around that. Why is a lot of Africans' artifacts, heritage being displayed abroad? Instead, a lot of Americans travel to France, to Britain, to London to look at African artworks. Why can't it be that they are coming to Nigeria, Senegal, for instance, to see these artworks and truly learn about the people? And it's not just artworks that have also been taken. We need to also, the human resource that have also been forcibly taken out of the continent. There has to be some form of reckoning, racial reckoning. This was done by people of another race to another race. And I think that is really at the heart of this matter. And both government, the people, and a lot of people need to come to the table to have these discussions all over the continent. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I mean, I hear you speaking to the racial basis of this, of the exploitation, right, and that played out throughout the colonial project, and the legacies that we're seeing for that today, right? Yes.
I'd like to join in. My response to that, because this is actually the point that actually began my intellectual research, my intellectual journey, is this idea that there's, race was an American problem or a South African problem. And I figured out, I think I figured out two main reasons why people think this. There's this notion that I think there's a misunderstanding of what race is. And so the premise, so the premise that we have to start is, first of all, that the ideas of race, the notion of race is global. But to think about race is to not think about race as biology, but to think about race as the meanings we ascribe to presumed differences. And to think about processes of racialization where you have historical processes that actually create notions of race, create notions of difference, and so on, right? And so if we look at the world that we're in, right, you have the contemporary world is structured and run by the West, and it's the result of this modern moment, and the result of European expansion, the establishment of colonies, slavery, and the trade in Africans, and then the ultimate global hierarchy that is set up that we still have today, right? Where we have what Michel Rolph-Trouillot, the anthropologist, would call, the hierarchy of races, nations, and cultures, right? Where Africa you know, remains at the bottom of this hierarchy because of its presumed Blackness, even though Africa is very diverse, right? But Blackness is associated with Africa in particular. So that's the first. The second thing I think is, and I think for people in the continent and outside of the US and outside of South Africa, is our assumption that ethnicity or notions of ethnicity, or what people used to call tribe, right? It's you know, it has been constructed as something primordial, as something very different than race, and people don't see the relationship of race to ethnicity or ethnic groups, nation groups, and so on. And so what I try to do is think about how systematic and structural the colonial process was, in that it actually did sediment supposed ethnic groups as if they were primordial, as if it did not allow groups of people, communities to emerge and grow in the way that they would have naturally emerged. But it consolidated particular groups, it created groups where groups were needed, and it made it seem like it was a natural order of things, so that we don't see that ethnicization that emerges with the colonial power is actually part of the racializing process of separating Africans, you know, and then Europeans, and then having this, you know, and having it us assume that our relationships are Africans with Africans, and we're not talking about necessarily the vertical relationships. So then we have this idea then that race is not an issue, that race is about racial violence only, even though it is. But racialization, the way that we see ourselves, we don't see that we are all linked in this racializing process as well. The entire world is racialized, and the entire world lives within this particular hierarchy that was structured by the modern West. And for me, what's clear is there are two things, and I'm gonna stop in a minute, but the other key thing is what we always still see when we think about the Africa continues to represent the side of racial otherness. And we see it, for example, in the continued breaking off of the continent of North Africa versus Sub-Saharan Africa. And people throw around the word Sub-Saharan as if it's a normal thing. It was constructed by the racial scientists to say there's a white North and a Black South. And that is, if that itself is not about racialization, I don't know what is. And then I think about Sarkozy, who went to Senegal as recently as like 2007 and basically said, the African man has never entered history. So that, and so tells us all our ideas about Africa are really based on this notion of Africa's Blackness and its backwardness, and linked to this global processes of race making. So I'll stop there and continue.
For us, I mean, first of all, I'm very honored to be here. I mean, among you know, in MIT and among everyone here. I'm just a cartoonist, so I'm very happy to be here. Well, I'm from Sudan. And as Dr. Fateh knows, you know, we're in the intersection basically between, you know, the North and the South and the East, and you know, we're in the heart of it. And in Sudan, you know, we had the longest running war in Africa, of course, you know, with the South Sudanese and the North. And it was basically, you know, the whole Sudan, the idea of Sudan, the country of Sudan was constructed after the British left Sudan and Egypt, and then we seceded from Egypt. And race is a huge part of Sudan's identity, or the little that we try to know of it. I mean, one of our biggest issue is basically our knowledge of us. You know, the question of who is Sudanese, and it's all based on race. I mean, we had the longest running war. You know, the South now seceded, and you know, during the Black Lives Matter protests, I wrote an op-ed for Al Jazeera about that. And because I lived most of my life, you know, as a child, I was in Sudan, and I went to school in Sudan, and of course everybody was Sudanese, different races, different colors, but everybody was Sudanese. And then I moved to Doha, to Qatar, with my family, to Qatar, and in my class there was 20 nationalities, right? And in Sudan, I'm considered, you know, the top class. I'm considered the oppressor, basically, because I'm from the North, I'm from the Arabized tribes, I'm Muslim, all of these things. And then I moved to Doha, where I'm supposed to be part of my oppressor group, like, you know, the Arabs and the Muslims and all of that. And I go there and I'm considered, you know, I'm considered the Black person. And for me as a child, that was a shock, you know, and it's you don't grasp the whole truth, but this is what it was. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of things, but it's really a huge issue that we have in Sudan right now. And I think it's one of the main issues, basically, of our self-identification in Sudan that we have right now. The question of, are we Arab, are we Muslim, who are we, what's your tribe? What's your tribe is it's the first question someone will ask you. So it's it's really, I can relate to everything Dr. Jemima said, definitely.
Yes, Ronipa, there you go.
Yes, I'm here. I also just would like to extend my thanks for the invitation. And, I feel very honored to be in this sort of august panel. Since South Africa keeps coming up as an exception, first, I want to perhaps challenge that idea of South African exceptionalism, and then talk about actually what has happened in South Africa over the last 30 years. So, like everywhere else in the world, South Africans consume media, they are on social media, so whatever happens, race will be talked about in South Africa, just because we are now part of the world. And that's a very important aspect of talking about race, precisely because one of the things that people don't often understand about the impact of apartheid on South Africa is that Black South Africans largely lived for half a century in isolation. Everything in South Africa was censored. The news that we watched were carefully curated, even the TV programs that we watch. So for example, I normally say to people, I know nothing about Sesame Street because Sesame Street was actually banned in South Africa. The apartheid state thought it was all about racial mixing. So we didn't grow up watching Sesame Street. Instead, we grew up watching manga cartoons because somehow the apartheid state thought that was acceptable, but Sesame Street was not. So that's an example of how isolated the country was for half a century. So in some ways, when it comes to talking about the meaning of race, South Africans are, quote unquote, a couple of decades behind the rest of the continent, but also behind the rest of the diaspora, simply because we missed out on a lot of the debates. But having said that, one of the interesting paradoxes then is that our constitution has now forced us to shuttle a little bit forward, so that in some ways we missed a particular conversation about race and racialization. And then all of a sudden in 1996, when the Constitution was promulgated, we were suddenly told we now live in a non-racial society. We now live in a non-tribal society because our Constitution does not recognize tribes. We now live in a non-tribal society. We now live in a gender equal society. We now live in a progressive society. And so one of the things that happens then in South Africa is what one could call a kind of cognitive dissonance, in which on the one side, we want to participate in all the conversations that we've missed in the Black diaspora. But then on the other side, the Constitution simply says no. So for example, a couple of years ago, a South African musician called Mbongeni Ngema, the person who wrote Sarafina, produced a song called Indians. And this song was about what he thought was the real exploitative relationship between Black Africans and Indians. And the song played once on the radio, and the South African Equality Commission said, this is hate speech, it cannot be on the radio, it has to be taken off the radio. So you have exactly this kind of, and Mbongeni Ngema's defense was, but this is the truth. This is my experience as a Black person in South Africa. And the Equality Commission was like, no, it violates the Constitution. So you end up with a very interesting set of debates in South Africa where you have all these statutory bodies whose job essentially is to make sure that whenever there's a racial issue that comes up in South Africa, it is dealt with formally by the state. And so whether even if you post something on Facebook that is racist, in South Africa, you will more likely end up in front of one of those statutory bodies. And so what that does in a very bizarre kind of way is it shuttles us into a future for which I would say many South Africans were not prepared. A future in which racism is not a topic of conversation, precisely because if you say something racist, then you are essentially violating the law. But also tribalism is not an acceptable way of speaking about certain things. I mean, obviously people make jokes, they post memes, sort of tribally inflected jokes, But you cannot say to somebody else, I don't like you because you belong to X tribe, or you are an oppressor because you belong to X tribe. That is simply not part of the conversation. So I wanted to put that as a different way of speaking about South Africa, as this sort of cognitive dissonance between the conversations that we've missed because we were living in isolation, and then the conversation that in some ways we are being pushed to simply because our constitution places particular demands on the population. And a lot of South Africans actually now find the constitution quite difficult to deal with, exactly because the constitution simply says, no, that is not a topic for conversation. No, you cannot say that in public. No, you cannot blame Indians for all your problems. No, you can. So there are a lot of no's, and many South Africans, especially Black South Africans, are finding that very, very difficult, to such an extent that I would say in South Africa, there's now a movement, what I call a kind of revisionist movement, where people actually go back to the origins of the constitution and want to revise that by sort of presenting a different historical narrative about how the constitution came into being. And so there is, as I say, this very almost touchy and painful now conversation between the future that is being projected for us by the constitution and then the past that many of us have to live with simply because we are Black and we have friends in different parts of the diaspora. So I just wanted to present that as perhaps a different way of talking about South Africa, rather than sort of repeating this idea of South African exceptionalism. Race is there, but so is the constitution, and the constitution largely prescribes the manner in which we can talk about race in South Africa.
Yeah, that is absolutely, yes, Shamima, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor McKenna. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you for that. I actually think you're absolutely, I agree with you in that sense, because part of it is people do talk about South Africa before, before the end of apartheid as the only place where we have racial conflict, so a lot of the books were about like comparing South Africa to the US South and so on, right, in terms of apartheid. But I did want to have this rejoinder in terms, in fact, what's actually interesting to me in what you said is that talking about South Africa in the post-colonial moment or post-apartheid moment is very similar to me in the way that race is understood in other places on the African continent post-independence, because the assumption is that once you get rid of colonialism, right, race goes with it. Race and racial processes go along with it, along with the white bodies, right? When the reality is, it's actually not the case. But I think, so, what's interesting is, what happens is that people are supposed to think colonialism is done, white people are gone, and so we don't necessarily need to talk about race. We need to talk about national identity formation. We need to, figure out how to deal with so-called tribalism. And so I do think we're actually, in a similar place in thinking about this post-colonial independent moment, that race is not supposed to matter. And actually, that's when it structurally matters even more if we think about it. And then actually thinking it doesn't matter makes it much more difficult to deal with realities on the ground. So I appreciate that intervention.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I hear kind of three lines of response. One is your point, Dr. Peer, about the fact that no space, nobody escapes global racialization processes, right? And so, and the illusion of racialization and race being tied to specifically the presence or to racial oppression in colonialism or in apartheid, for instance. And I think it's also really interesting to look at the Sudanese case and the South African case side by side, because there are ways, for different reasons. The Sudanese case, because as you bring up, Khalid, like the fact that it's entirely about race, or race is at the heart of it. And yet, even in the stories, even when South Africa is being used in this exceptionalist sense, we don't bring up, Sudan. We don't talk about Sudan in terms of the place of race. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, Shamima, about the North-South divide, which kind of cuts off, in some respects, Sudan from the rest of much of the continent.
One of the oldest stories that we know of like Sudan's victory, or the Nubians' victory, right, is that the Nubians were not conquered by the Muslims. So there was a long war, and then the Nubians were really good archers. And in Arabic, they call them Rumat al-Hadaq. Al-Hadaq is like the eyeball. And they kept the Muslims out for such a long time, but then the Christian Nubians fell, right, because of the blockade that they had on them and so on. But one of the oldest stories is that part of that deal that they did, and it's called al-Baqt in Arabic, is that they had to give 360 slaves every year. So for me, I think that's when the problem of Sudan started. Who are they giving? Who's a slave and who's not, right? So this is basically for me this is how everything started from there. Everyone wanted to not be that slave, right? So from there, maybe like the whole tribalism started. Like these are the tribes that go to slavery, these are not. So, but this is literally one of the oldest stories that you'll hear. Any most popular story, and people say it like it's not, like this, we kept the Muslims out, and then, but they keep that part out. But it's that for me is very interesting, is that who was a slave and who wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, so this is, Bukola, were you gonna, yes, please.
I just wanted to chime into Jemima's point about how the fact that most countries have gained independence in Africa, it means that the whites and slavers are gone and things are all kumbaya right now. And that is what is happening in Cameroon. I mean, Cameroon is in the heat of an Anglophone crisis because a section of the country is saying the English-speaking provinces in the country are saying we are marginalized, while the French-speaking country that were colonized by the French Empire and all that are saying they control the government, they control the resources. So there's still the economic divide. Even though the white presence is out of the country, they've left an economic, a tribal, just political division that has not been interrogated till now and being named what it is. These are problems along the lines of race, the colonial past, being enslaved. And a lot of people in the country are still contending with that. And I think the conversation around what is being, how we are reckoning with this is so important in these countries. It's so heartbreaking how this has just been left to fester for such a period of time. And I was hoping that not just the conversation in the US was going to kickstart our own interrogation of what is happening in our countries, but so be it. I just quickly wanted to chime in about that.
Please, thank you. Yes, Solonipa, please jump in. You had your hand up.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm gonna take off from Bukola's comment, because actually in South Africa, what is interesting when it comes to language, again, the Constitution recognizes all our languages. So the English, Afrikaans, Zulu, they are all at the same level. They are all official languages. But what is interesting is that many of these movements that are filtering to South Africa via social media are very monolingual. So most South Africans then start to translate many of these ideas into indigenous languages. And again, I don't really sit on social media, and I also don't really watch TV, but I often hear this from my cousins. So many of them would say, how do you say Black Lives Matter in Zulu? Like, what is the actual words that you would use to say Black Lives Matter in Zulu? We want to know. So because I'm a professor, I'm supposed to come up with the answer. So many of the problems that we have in South Africa are exactly about how do you translate many of these concepts into 11 languages, because you have 11 languages and everyone will want to participate in their own language. So, I mean, let me give you the example of the implication of this. When Jacob Zuma was on trial for rape, he absolutely insisted that he would only testify in his own mother tongue, in isiZulu. And so as a Zulu speaker, you would watch the court and you would watch the judge listening, you would watch the translator talking, and then there would be total moments of hilarity because the translator would not know how to translate certain concepts from Zulu into English. And Jacob Zuma would then turn around and almost correct the translator. Say, that's not what I meant. And this is what I meant. And so in South Africa, actually, what you have is the problem that a lot of the conversations about race and racism are actually monolingual conversations. And they are not really being easily translated into multiple languages in which then everyone can participate and offer their own perspective on that. And this problem of monolingualism is also in reverse, the association that you have to speak good English in order to be able to participate in these conversations. So people immediately say, oh no, that's just for you who speak good English. It's not for us who don't speak good English. In South Africa, the phrase that people use is our English data bundles will run out. So we will not participate. You go and you speak. And so you end up with a very bizarre sort of relationship between language and actual people's ability to participate in political discourse, because actually English becomes a kind of block, despite the assumption that English is a universal language. It actually becomes a kind of block, and most people then end up simply being silent and not participating, and then allowing the elites in South Africa, middle class, upper middle class, Black South Africans, to largely speak on behalf of everybody else. And the only alternative discourses that you will find then are on social media. So I'll give you a little bit of a joke where a couple of days ago, a friend of mine posted this young woman saying, you know, when you spoke in English the whole day, it's sore here. I get a pain here on my jaw. Says, this is why English is wrong. I will not be speaking English all day. Zulu, on the other hand, I can speak it all day and I don't get this pain in my jaw. So, I mean, this is the way in which many indigenous South Africans or many people who do not have the language capacity to participate in English discussions react simply by making fun of those of us who speak English and therefore are associated with this global world. So I also just wanted to contribute that, again, in the case of South Africa, because the Constitution recognizes everyone's language as equal. So in the Constitution, English is equal to my own language, isiZulu. It's equal to Setswana, it's equal to isiXhosa. Whenever you require a government document or whatever, you can request it in your own language. When you testify in court, you can request to testify in your own language. The state sends out documents in 11 languages, et cetera, et cetera. But there is still this tension between the association of English with a sort of upper class or middle class discourses. And then the assumption that people who don't speak good English are therefore not invited to the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what you're all raising, one of the things you're all raising is sort of the intersecting struggles, or so opening up the question about race and its relevance in the individual countries, but then also across the continent, raises questions about the obstacles maybe to that are built into different contexts. So Hlonipa, you're talking about the constitutional issues, right? The restrictions that the Constitution poses for addressing or raising race and racial injustice, or Khalid, speaking about the narratives of that Sudan has of the dominant discourse about Sudan and Sudan's origin and who the Sudanese are. And the question of language, right? Like the language that is available, that is used, through which these concepts can be used. So I wonder if this can be a way for us to transition to maybe talking about where you see the fronts maybe of struggles for racial justice either in your individual context, or I know, Jemima, you're also working on resources extraction and looking at it within a colonial lens. Like, where do you see as the main fronts of struggles for racial justice in your various contexts? The context that you work on or in today, or the most urgent or the most promising?
Yeah, I had a couple of things to say. The first one is about language and thinking about race. Is that race is actually a term that we use to express certain kinds of relationships. So race is not a thing as much as it is a relationship of power. So there are ways that even when people don't use the words race, enact race, practice race, right? Have relationships that reflect racial hierarchies. And that's, one of the things when I was thinking about when I was working on my book, is not that people were going around saying this is race and racism. They were describing certain processes and relationships and that actually reflected a particular kind of hierarchy based on presumed distinction, right? And so, and I want to be clear, because part of it is not that language doesn't matter as much as it is that we use race, but race only is a signifier for all kinds of unequal relationships that we see. And so to link that then to thinking about, how we think about racial justice work, I think about, we have to go back to the way the world is structured. There's a reason why we have the first world, the developed world, the global north, and then we have the global south, the underdeveloped south, the underdeveloped world, or developing. And so part of that, to me, all these are legacies of this long colonial project, which, South African scholar Bernard Magubani said, the conquest of Africans was not a monetary act of violence that stunned us and then ended. It was the beginning of an endless process. And we see it, for me, in terms of thinking about debt, right? Thinking about IMF and World Bank debt, austerity, neoliberal policies that are based on this global structure, this hierarchy where, formerly colonized countries are still indebted to their colonies, are still stuck in this cycle of debt and as sources of places where you extract resources and so on. So if we look at the Congo, which is a long history of racialized extraction and debasement, you can see that. And you can see that now, right, with this whole Green New Deal, which means more extraction being taken from Africa. So if we take the originary moment of the structuring of the world, which was done through race and constructing, which was done through conquest and then the ideology of race to justify this conquest, then we have to think about all these movements for equality and so and to have the continent on par and not be a source of endless dumping of electronics by the North, extraction. We have to see that as racial justice, for me. And so that's what I think about when I think about racial justice movements on the African continent. But also, even as people are protesting police and state, the bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, that's also linked to this long history of neocolonialism that's linked to this originary moment of colonial conquest. And so for me, I think that that's important for us to actually make these links between the local and the global, because if we don't do that, we don't see the connections between movements from like the Sudan, to Nigeria, to Uganda, and so I think it's important for us to see that and to understand historically why that matters for all these places around the world. What links them together is that long history.
Yes.
Is it possible for me to add something to that?
Please.
Is because actually for me, I think the biggest crisis that is facing many Black South Africans is not the inability to engage in debates on race and racism. It's actually an inability to engage with the African continent, period. And to me, that is much more of an urgent issue, precisely because in South Africa, you will hear a lot of Black people who will say, like if I say, oh, I'm going to Senegal, they'll say, oh, you're going to Africa. And I'm like, and where are you? And there's understanding that Africa is something that's out there. It is not me. And I often also get asked, people come up to me and say, are you South African? And I say, yeah, what do you mean, am I South African? And they say, well, you don't speak like a South African. And I say, well, what does that mean? What am I supposed to speak like? So as somebody who also gets racialized or ethnicized as an outsider of South Africa, I also often have to have this conversation with people like, so what do you think the African continent actually means if you keep asking me and telling me that I look African or you're going to Africa? So that to me is a much more urgent conversation, precisely because it reflects a certain aspect of the issues of self-identity that, again, apartheid warped the way in which Black South Africans think about the relationship to the rest of the continent, where in some ways, there is an assumption that South Africa is not part of the continent, that somewhere out there, there are people called Africans, but we are not Africans. But it's also the way that it is articulated, that distance from the African continent, because it's often articulated in ways that either lead to violence, which is the xenophobia, but also lead to a certain amount of misidentification, where people assume that South Africa's history is different from the rest of the continent. So when you tell people about historical processes that link us to the rest of the continent, they sort of look at you wide-eyed, like, did that really happen? You know, so if, for example, if you tell the history of the whole region, how South Africa is linked to Mozambique, how it's linked to Botswana, how it's linked to Namibia, how people often look at that and be like, no, but we are a separate thing. We're not part of the story of the African continent. So I would say, if there was anything that I would project into the future as something that South Africans specifically need to do, the kind of intellectual, conceptual, structural work in terms of understanding racism, is to understand our relationship to the rest of the continent before we can even begin to have a conversation about the diaspora. Because as I say, South Africans already think their country ends at the Limpopo, and beyond that, they don't want to know what goes on there. And I mean, I can give you various examples of this distancing, but it is part of the consequence of apartheid ideology, that Black South Africans don't think that they are living on the African continent. And so I think that is one of the basic issues that needs to be articulated in such a way that it includes the global story of racism, but also it includes an African story. So let me give you why it is that is particularly important. So slavery in South Africa, for example, South Africa was a slave colony, but the slaves who came to South Africa didn't come from the transatlantic slave trade. They came from the East. So most of us are not descendants of slaves. And the people who are the descendants of slaves often don't want to talk about slavery. And so you end up again with a very strange conversation in which, as a Black African, I basically become like a ventriloquist when I talk about slavery, because my ancestors were not actually enslaved. The slaves that ended up in South Africa were imported into South Africa from the Dutch Empire. And you end up having a very strange disjuncture and a crossing of paths, because you are actually having a conversation that has nothing really to do with your own history. And the person who should be talking about the history doesn't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about slavery. And the reason is exactly the fact that under apartheid, the apartheid state created a different racial category called Malay, which was meant to be for the people who were the descendants of slaves. And that alone has created all sorts of intellectual and spiritual and cultural problems in trying to reconcile what the apartheid state meant by Malay, and then a kind of post-apartheid understanding in which Blackness becomes a kind of global and diasporic identity. Now, so if you were categorized as Malay under apartheid, does that mean that just because apartheid is now over, you are now Black? What does that, so those are the questions that I think in South Africa, we need to focus on as part of our, and I will use the word re-entry into a global conversation about race and Blackness and racism.
That's great. Khalid, I'll let you speak in just 1 minute. I just want to remind, so we have a couple questions from the audience, and also to remind the audience, if you have more questions, put them in the chat, although we just have about 5 minutes left. But I'll just raise the questions that have come up. One has to do with how class factors, like my understanding of the question is, how do we think about these questions of race when we factor class and indigeneity into the question? I think, Nolipa, you were starting to speak to that a little bit about the complexities when we think about slavery and indigeneity and their intersections with race that work in different ways in different contexts. And then another question had to do with, it says the greatest violence we see in Africa is state-sponsored violence on citizens, especially minorities, and it seems that it's a response to actual/perceived interference from foreign actors. What are your thoughts? So I'll just throw that in the mix, but Khalid, you were going to speak up before.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the biggest issue for Africans as an African is access, is that these borders that were made for us, that we fight over today, are not borders that we made. You know, this was an open land, tribal land. People walked in and out, went, you know, my family used to walk all the way from our town, which is called Al Khandaq, all the way to, you know, Chad and Senegal and all the way to West Africa. So this doesn't happen anymore. For me to get a visa, let alone like go to the States or God forbid go to Europe, that's the whole thing. But like just going to neighboring Egypt or going to neighboring Ethiopia, or, you know, have to stand in line for hours. And that these borders are not only borders, physical borders, these are also educational borders. These are also borders for us to feel that unity that was there, you know, not so far long ago, you know. So that, for me, that's the biggest issue, is that knowledge about you know, education about all of Africa, how we're related, what happened, you know, all of these things I think are very important to solidify that African union or that African personality in you. I mean, in Sudan, it's super hard. I mean, there's no access to anything, first of all, and because we were Arabized, we were Islamized, you know, and in a certain way that, you know, yes, there are Arabs, yes, there are Muslims, but there's also a million other things. You know, there's like, you know, a lot of tribes, there's a lot of languages. None of that was put on there, and the relationship, you know, the Fulanis that are from, you know, Mauritania and Senegal all the way to South, like these are a part of Sudan. So we don't study that, we don't know that, you know. So I think, and I think that's a huge undertaking that we should take, at least for the next generation.
Mm-hmm. Khalid has just touched on a very important point in terms of access, not just geographical access, even historical access to all what has gone between all the historical past that we have, what connects Nigeria to Ghana, what connects Namibia to South Africa. It's always just so shocking how difficult it is for all of us, for people from different countries across Africa, to even access anywhere by flights. Many people have to travel. If I want to go to Senegal, I have to go to France, then fly into Senegal. It's unbelievable. And at the end of the day, it just erodes the kind of friendship and just knowledge sharing that needs to come for us to just have this conversation. And Khalid has touched on a point. I don't think the African Union is the body that is going to take up this conversation. I think individual governments also need to sit around the table and just look at this roadblocks and bottlenecks with access. Is going to neighboring Cotonou from Nigeria is actually very difficult. I would rather.
There was a picture of the African Union passport going around a few years ago. Have you seen that? It comes out every year and then it disappears. Nothing happens.
I mean, when the uprising in Sudan, the one that toppled the dictator, that's Bashir, when that was happening, we could get no one to fly to Sudan because there was just no access. And how do we report about that? How do we talk about that when we don't even understand it? We're not communicating with the people on the ground. So it's a real challenge. And with South Africa too, I mean, what you were saying about how people just say, I've had people say like, oh, South Africa is not part of Africa. I've heard people say, oh, I've heard South Africans say, oh, we're different from the rest of Africa. And this division continue to fracture our relationships along ethnic lines and not along racial lines. And I think that is really even at the heart of the conversation, like we've been going on. If there's going to be any form of racial or translational justice, this needs to be addressed.
I'd like to add.
I think the term divide and conquer is really like what we see right now. It's like it's basically what it is, and it will continue to happen until today. And it's also that divide, as you mentioned in the beginning, between the North and Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, it's exactly that. I was in Morocco, and Marrakesh looks exactly like where I'm from in Sudan. It looks like Omdurman. It looks exactly the same. But and I was there, and people were asking me, like, where are you from? I was like, I'm from Sudan. They're like, which Sudan? I was like, what do you mean, which Sudan? He's like, which Sudan? I was like, Sudan, like Khartoum. He's like, oh, like Egypt, Sudan. You know, so that's That's how they look at us. You know, like everything under us is Sudan. Sudan in Arabic means lands of the black, basically.
Yeah, and I'd like to just say something quickly about this, because to talk about race as global and the hierarchies of the world is to not deny the complexities on the ground local, because different places have different historical relationships with global race. So, you know, the Francophone, you know, so-called Francophone, right? The country, you know, the Portuguese, you know, colonial processes were very brutal in very different ways, right? In terms of thinking about Mozambique and Angola, in fact, that the Portuguese refused to give up Mozambique, right? And the brutality of the independence wars. The French were very different, you know, in terms of like not having indirect rule compared to the British and then the Dutch. And also, but we also have to remember, so we understand that to say that race is global, to say that there's a hierarchy is to not deny the specificities of historical relationships, but to also say that they continue to work with one another, because that is the only way we have to think about how it is that if you're in Morocco, they call you Black, if you're from sub-Saharan Africa, but not if you're, you know, Morocco. The ideas of Blackness continue. And even if Black people in South Africa, for example, were not enslaved, by the time colonization happened, the ideologies of race based on the experience of the enslavement of people of Africans in the New World were already part and parcel of racial science and the construction of the world. And so the point is then to that, you know, Blackness means something even when it articulates in different ways. It means something to the rest of the world. It means something to the way that someone treats you when you're at an airport in Europe, or, you know, if you get to the airport, right? Or who becomes a migrant and all of that stuff. But it also impacts how Africa as a continent, even when you have all these divisions, is seen by the rest of the world. How it is that it becomes like the playground for the rest of Europe still, right? So you have military bases all over the US, you have, all over the African continent, you know, the growth of AFRICOM, the militarization of the continent, you have the competition for the continent, the need for all its resources. And so of course, these divisions are always going employed, right, as a way to make it seem like these things are not connected to one large process that began in 1492 or earlier, right? So I just wanted to be clear that I said that because somebody asked about class. I think class is important. But class is important in the US as well. You know, at the same time you have, Kamala Harris and Barack Obama, you have Black, George Floyd being killed, or just 2 days ago, the young men being killed. And so we can have a bourgeoisie, as Fanon would call it, right? The national bourgeoisie. We can have class relations that still doesn't diminish the importance of this structure that we live in, that still impact us in different ways, but impact us nevertheless, and maintain a hierarchy no matter, where we are in the world. So I wanted to just really stress that, because I don't want that to get lost in focusing on the particularities, which are important, but I do think the global nature of it is important.
Yeah, and I do think the two pieces are actually completely, are completely complementary, or saying the same. What you're describing, Jemima, is that there's this underlying structure, the underlying foundations that then, gives rise to the many different manifestations that we see in different places. But then it's actually quite striking that what I'm hearing from all of you is coming back to this, the need for remapping or reintegration of the continent, which is, it's super interesting about South Africa. I also had that experience being in South Africa and being like, I'm from Togo, like, oh, you're from Africa. And I was so confused, but like having those, and it seems that many of us have had that experience. So, but this remapping is no accident. The need for the remapping is no accident, right? Because the mapping is both the mapping of the continent and the positioning of the continent in the world is the product of these long-running historical processes that you're pointing to. And so I think what everyone's saying is actually quite complementary. And the challenge, of course, in a conversation like this is not reconciling, but the fact that, each case is in some regards its own universe, with all its complexities, right? But then, and we're trying to kind of see what the nexus for all of them, all these different cases is. And I think brought that a little bit to the fore. You know, I had another like 6 questions for us to get into, and I like that we got through 1.5, maybe, which just goes to show the depth and the complexity of these issues. And I know that there are breakout rooms where we can continue these conversations. I just wanted to maybe, let's see if there's, I mean, I'll just say kind of some of the other questions that came up had to do with the slave trade. And I imagine the transatlantic slave trade. And the question was, what role does recovering Africa's role in the slave trade play in contemporary discussions of race on the continent? And perhaps the silence surrounding race in Africa is due to our own ugly past. And I'm at the hour there is West Africans' participation in the transatlantic slave trade. Renipa, I saw your hand up, and I'm wondering, what's the deal with the breakout rooms? Can we take 2 more minutes and then be late in our breakout rooms? Because it's a shame to stop right here. So maybe let's do this. So I will invite you to speak to that question if you like, or to offer kind of one, like a general comment to close out this portion of the discussion, and then we can continue in the breakout rooms after this. How's that? Yeah. And for everyone to offer comments, a general comment is what I meant. Yes.
Okay, so the story that I want to tell is actually about how complicated many of these intersections are. So when I lived in Cape Town and I was doing my PhD, I lived with a white family, and when I moved in, their children were literally like, one of them had just been born and the mother was pregnant with another one. So the children literally grew up with me living in the cottage in the garden. When I left South Africa in 2005 to go to the United States, the eldest daughter was probably only about 4 or 5. And I asked the kids to make presents for me. This young girl drew the map of Africa. She's a white child. She drew a map of Africa, and the map of Africa only had like 4 countries on it. And so literally she drew these humongous countries all over the African continent. And then she put a little dot where Cape Town is, and she wrote home. And I kept that image because at the time, this was a 4-year-old child who was basically telling me, and this is how I normally tell people, that I'm a Pan-Africanist. So that's what I said to her. At the time, I said, congratulations, girl, you are a Pan-Africanist. And just to tell you, fast forward a couple of years later, she's now a teenager and she's got something around her neck. And I ask her what it is. She says, oh, it's a pendant, but I actually don't know what it is because I just found it at a thrift shop. She says, maybe you can tell me since you're a professor. So I turn this pendant over, and all I can see on the tail side of the pendant is that it's a coin, but it's got an elephant in it on the backside. And I say, I think this is a coin of Jomo Kenyatta. And she says, oh, and she Googles it, and it was exactly right. So this white child is walking around with a coin with Jomo Kenyatta on it. So I'm like, you were raised by me, obviously, because as I say, I used to have quite a close relationship with the family. So how do you then have a conversation about Africa and race when, as I say, in South Africa, you will have a white child like the white child that I grew up with in a cottage in Cape Town, who, number one, drew the map of Africa exactly the way that we are talking about it, almost virtually borderless. And number two, who walks around with the pendant with Jomo Kenyatta on it. And so it actually creates a lot of, in my case, a lot of anger amongst many Black South Africans, because by doing all of those things, this young woman is essentially saying, I'm white, but I'm an African. And it complicates exactly this question of race, because how then do you say to her, no, you are not an African because you do not experience structural racism? She said, but that's not the reason why I'm an African. I'm an African because I was born here. I don't have any other home. I don't have any other passport to any other country. I do not have an exit point out of Africa. Whatever happens in Africa, I die here and I live and I die here. So I wanted to sort of tell you those two stories about this young woman who, as I say, I practically raised, because she used to come to my cottage and eat curry with me. And now she cooks a lot of curries. And she said, it's because of you. You taught me how to eat curries. And so I whenever I have conversations with her, she always reminds me of how complicated, in fact, an African identity truly is, precisely because, as I say, she's white, she's African, and she does not have any wishes to be anywhere else in the world. She wants to be on the African continent. And so if the conversation about Africa constantly sort of reverts back to the question of structural racism, then it means that either we are expecting her to start talking as if she is also a victim of structural racism, or we have to find another basis on which a white child who grew up in Cape Town, who's privileged, went to privileged schools, but identifies as an African, has to speak about what it means to be an African in 2020, in 2021.
Yes, I wanna invite you all to thank you for that, Oniba. And I bringing in the, anyway, thank you for adding in this dimension and reminding them, because part of the conversation, of course, about race in Africa is the fact that Blackness and Africanness are not, Africanness is not equal Blackness, right? And this goes to a point about what race is, right? And racialization as really the thing that we're after. And just a organizational point, I think we might actually cancel the breakout rooms and just keep talking here, because there's so much coming up that I think we can all benefit from. So with that, Jemima, please, you were going to respond.
Yes. And one of the things for me when in talking about race and structural racism is to differentiate between individual relationships and you know, not to, but, and then what happens, right? What does it mean to be white in the world? I mean, I guess the better thing is to think about, well, what does it mean to be white and European in the world? What does it mean to be white in Africa? What does it mean to be white in Haiti, where, you know, I was born? What does it mean to be white in the US? And those to me, so structural racism is not necessary, to talk about structural race is to not necessarily just focus on, it's to talk about the structures that maintain this hierarchy in the world so that whites still own most of the land in South Africa, for example. So we can have individual nice people, like and I usually joke like, and it's true, some of my best friends are white, right? I mean, yes. But at the same time, the way that the world is structured means that we have, you know, we have the representation, no matter what we want to say, the representation of Africa as the continent that's always already, you know, dark. And people think about Africa this way, which is why those of us who teach African studies, the first thing we do in the first couple of weeks is going against the stereotypes of Africa, right? We do that because the stereotypes continue. We can only think, for example, of when Ebola broke out a few years ago, you know, the newspaper, the Newsweek, I think, had a picture of an ape, you know, representing, saying, you know, we don't want the disease, you know, from Africa coming to the US. So there's a way that even as we have individual relationships, individual stories, there's a way that the way that Africa is constructed in the world and to us continues to replicate this hierarchy, so much so that, you know, Black immigrants in the US are treated very differently, you know, than white immigrants. They're called immigrants. White people in Africa are called expats, where we have the whole development apparatus, which is Teju Cole called the white savior industrial complex, which is very much racialized. This idea that Africans can't govern themselves. So this whole notion of good governance, capacity building, all of that, when, you know, in the US, we had Donald Trump. But people are not talking about corruption in this sense. People are not talking about the violence of US empire because it's linked to a particular kind of racialization of the world. And I think it's important for us to always keep in mind that the individual relationships are important in their world because we're all human beings, right? And we should see each other as human beings. But the reality is that our world is continually structured in a way that does not make these individual relationships, you know, impact the way that the rest of the world deals with the African continent. Because if it did, we would not have so much inequality in the way that the world deals with the continent. And I think we need to be aware of that. And I also wanted to say, and I guess if we're gonna end, I wanted to also talk about, we also need to remember, there's a long history of Pan-Africanism, you know, and I think we forget that, you know, there's the whole Pan-Africanist movement grew, you know, early in the early 1900s when, you know, Black people from the various parts of the African continent or Africans, so we have to think about Nkrumah, we have to think about Nasir, we have to think about all of this long history as well of people coming together and trying to fight against this long history of colonial rule and exploitation. So I'll stop there for a moment.
Actually, so I was just going to say one thing. Oh yeah, just so, because we're just going to stay here. So we have another 10-ish minutes, and I'll just throw another thing in the mix that you can speak to if you can, which is linkages. So we've talked about the need for this sort of better integration, right, or of the continent. I'd love to hear about sort of links between between African countries and movements or action happening elsewhere, whether in the global south or in diaspora communities, because I know you're all involved in work that crosses borders also in that way. So if there's time to speak to that, I'd love to hear a little bit from you all about that. Yes, Khalid.
I just wanted to continue what Dr. Thumaima was saying about the Pan-Africanism, and also to your point about the connection. So in 1960s, the Black Panthers actually joined into the Pan-African conference in Algeria. They came in and they've met, and the same thing with Malcolm X. He came down to Africa and he visited Egypt, he visited Sudan, he visited all other countries. So I think that connection really made even the Black Panthers realize what's going on, and made that connection internationally about that this is not only in Africa, this is not only in America. The injustice is happening, the colonialism is actually happening, imperialism is actually happening all over, and we are targeted as people, right? So I think that these connections are still happening today. I mean, with my work, my cartoons are normally not targeted towards Sudanese, or because I think one of our biggest borders between us is language. So for me, I try as much as I can not to have like a no comment graphics, just to reach out to other people. And a lot of my cartoons were used by the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of it were used in the protests. Where Spike Lee wore my shirt, and about the Kaepernick, kneeling down and stuff. Maybe I could show it while we're talking about it. One second. All right, so this is a cartoon I did about Colin Kaepernick. And before that, I did a short documentary for The Guardian in 2018, I think, or 17, and it was about connecting the Arab Spring to what happened during the civil rights movement. Because for us, the civil rights movement worked because, of course, there was Obama, right? Well, now I don't know, but it was the right. Yeah, Obama's president. After years of the struggle, so we have a little RV, and we went around in the South and we visited places, the park where Stokely Carmichael first said, the Black Power. It was amazing to see, right? And during that time, it was exactly the same time that where Colin Kaepernick kneeled down, and the whole media frenzy about around that. So it was that connection as well, because also in the 60s, it was when the 1968 Olympics, I think, was it when the two runners did the Black Fist and the famous photo that came out of it. So for me, that was kind of the connection that the struggle is still happening, and it was amazing for me to visit these places in the South, and where the civil rights movement was so was born, and the movement was there and all of that. And I'm from Sudan, but the circumstance and the how poor those areas was shocking to me, because we always hear that America is America's the wealthiest countries in the world, and wealthiest country in the world, and the American dream and all of that. And when we saw these things, when we saw how poorly the African Americans are living, and I was there next to this park and there's a huge sign talking about the history of the park, where this is where Stokely Carmichael first mentioned the word Black Power, and the march moved from there and all of that. And there was a 30 I think she was 37-year-old grandmother. She was sitting there with her grandchild, and I asked her, "Do you know what happened in the park?" And she said, "The murder last week." I was like, "No, not the murder last week. The historical, what happened here, you know?" So it's they're so far removed from this history. It's incredible. It's really sad to see, and I mean, it's really sad to see what happened to us as well as, you know, in the Arab Spring as well. But, you know, I guess it's the connection where we need to you know, that needs to be established now, is between all these still liberation movements until today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The quick connection that came to my mind, the EndSARS protests in Nigeria about police brutality last year, and how that just sort of synergized. I mean, it was so organic, but it was happening at the same time, well, around the same time that the protest, the Black Lives Matter protest in the US was happening. And it gave a lot of protesters on the ground in Nigeria. At least I joined 3 protests before I came to the US. And every time we went out to cover and just participate in this protest, people were more energized and more fueled to talk about it, because it felt like a similar sort of struggle was happening in the US at the same time. And it was the connection, it was the conversation that people are tired, the citizens are tired of either state-sponsored or police repression on young people, and it resonated. And I think that has also been the reason why people continue to organize. Well, I'll speak for Nigeria, why the EndSARS protests, they sort of were able to look at the model of the Black Lives Matter. They reached out to protest, they reached out to the organizers. We're reading a lot about what was happening in the US, just to look for ways to sustain these demonstrations. And it may still be stillborn. The EndSARS protest may not have achieved all what it set out to achieve. But I'll say that what was happening in the US about police violence and the brutality just sort of sustained what was happening in Nigeria at the same time. And I would argue that it also gave it this sort of global recognition that the EndSARS protest has been able to, I mean, there was a lot of media coverage, a lot of governments and foreign governments were talking about it. And I think it was because it was also maybe not side by side, but around the time that the Black Lives Matter protests were also gaining so much traction and momentum across the world, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, all right, so we have time for just one. So Ruth, I know you wanted to respond, and then I will tie it together and we'll close. Please, go ahead.
I also have to, I'm gonna point to another paradox when it comes to South Africa, because actually when it comes to military and police hardware, we are more a perpetrator than a victim. There are no foreign military bases in South Africa. Not only that, but South Africa has got its own arms manufacturing company, which is a state-owned enterprise called Denel. South Africa manufactures helicopters that are sent and sold all over the world, Latin America, other African countries. We manufacture bulletproof vests, batons, all of these kinds of things. And so the problem is that from a South African perspective, from an objective perspective, South Africa is more of a perpetrator than a victim of police violence and military violence, because we actually sell and supply a lot of military hardware to other countries in the world and on the African continent. And so, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a standoff where COSATU wanted to stop a shipment of arms that was destined for Zimbabwe, but was coming in through a South African port. So even our ports are responsible for supplying guns and ammunition to the rest of the continent. South African mercenaries are still involved in assassinating people. So for example, when the Americans found Muammar Gaddafi after he went into hiding, there were rumors that it was actually South African mercenaries who had assisted the Americans in finding Muammar Gaddafi. So when we have these conversations about violence, it would be hypocritical for many South Africans to simply pretend that we are in the position of the victim, because actually our country is doing a lot of the supplying of military hardware to the rest of the continent and to other countries in Latin America, for example. And so again, when we have this conversation, it is about what are the structural conditions that mean that, in fact, South Africa is more of an imperial power than actually a victim of imperialism. Because in 2021, this is what is actually happening in South Africa. And then the other part of it is the cultural part of it. So for example, when Thabo Mbeki was president, Thabo Mbeki did a lot to try and participate in the Timbuktu, the preservation of the Timbuktu manuscripts. South Africa as a country paid a lot of money and tried to have this rapport. But instead, what ended up happening is that the whole conversation was interpreted as an imperial gesture. So in some ways, this is also the other example of how, even from a cultural perspective, whenever South Africa tries to participate in sort of cultural conversations on the African continent, the conversation ends up being an imperial one, simply because South Africans, as people say, come and they bring suitcases of money. And this is how the conversation starts. And so this is the other part of it. And I just wanted to also just put that position as a paradox, that when it comes to South Africa, it's very, very complicated to talk about military and police firepower on the African continent, because as a country, we are more of a perpetrator than a victim.
I feel like this needed to be, this was an hour and a half. I feel like we needed like a good 5 hours to get through the various pieces of this, because, and I mean, and in a way that's kind of the point, right? That these are not topics. There's several topics in play here, as we see. And to me, one of the striking things is a perennial issue in African studies or studies of the continent is that question about Africa as Africa in the world, Africa as a category of thought and within the global hierarchy, and then the realities of individual African countries, knowing that the two are interlinked, right? But then that they're also two separate parts. It's a different thing to look at the conditions of knowledge production about Africa and the world, and the global racialization processes that inform, kind of what Africa has come to mean in the world, and the fact that that touches all of us, and all of us in the most expensive sense, right? That we're all shaped by that. And so the need to both recognize that and to interrogate the specifics in various contexts. And to me, something that's come out across the various contributions is the fact that getting at the root of both historically and structurally of these questions is both a way of illuminating various struggles, right? So the examples that you gave, Khalid, for example, like how the Arab Spring and BLM and sort of white poverty in the US, also there was a ways that I assume the people you were talking about in the park were white, but I don't know if that was the case. But the ways that struggles that are happening in different parts of the world can illuminate each other, and the ways that in illuminating each other, these movements can also amplify one another, as you were pointing to, Bukola, with the NSARS and BLM and so on. So it's already 2 o'clock, and I feel like there's so much more to say, but for now, I will just limit myself to saying thank you all so much for accepting our invitation and for engaging in this really spirited and rich conversation. And I hope that we will continue to be in conversation on these very important topics. And for now, I will pass it on to my colleague, Al-Fatih Al-Tahir, to close us out.
Thank you. My name is Al-Fatih Al-Tahir, and I'm a faculty in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, and I am co-chair of this faculty steering committee, MIT steering committee on Africa. I would like, on behalf of the committee, on behalf of MIT, the faculty, the students, everyone, to thank our visitors today, our distinguished panelists, the 4 of you, for your engaging discussions and contributions and sharing with us your thoughts and your experiences. I especially actually enjoyed your use of the storytelling approach to making your points, which is very African. So thank you very much. Thank you to Amma for leading this very engaging session and framing the questions and leading the discussion. Thank you for all the attendees, all the people from MIT and elsewhere who participated in this event. This is the first in a series of events that the steering committee is planning. Hopefully, the following events are going to be in the physical world, not the cyber world. It's going to be visits by distinguished Africans from different areas of academia, industry, art, and all other areas. So we look forward to those events, and we are planning them now. Again, thank you for the panelists. Thank you for everyone, and have a very good afternoon, or I guess evening, and if some of you are in Europe or Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you for having me.
For having us. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.